The cold clung to the stone walls of a provincial railway station near Toulouse. In the half-light of dawn, a woman stood alone on the platform, her posture composed, her face unreadable beneath a nurse's veil. Around her, German patrols moved with practiced suspicion, their boots echoing off the iron canopy. The air smelt of coal smoke and fear. In her gloved hand she carried a medical satchel. Inside, forged papers, ration cards, and coded instructions bound for the resistance. The Gestapo had her name, her photograph, and a price on her head. Yet here she was, walking openly through occupied France. Moments earlier she had slipped from a safe house after a warning. The Germans were closing in. A change of clothes, a forged identity, and a new life bought in seconds. As the train hissed to life, Nancy Wake stepped aboard, leaving behind the nearest of 2 Gestapo dragnet operations that week. It would not be the last time she vanished from their grasp. The map of the continent had darkened almost overnight. From Oslo to Bordeaux, the black swastika banners hung over city halls and rail yards. France had fallen. The Wehrmacht stood at the Channel coast, watching Britain across a mere 20 miles of grey water. For London, the war had entered a new and perilous phase. Britain now stood alone. The Luftwaffe's bombs pounded its cities nightly. Radar operators along the southern coast tracked the endless waves. Yet even as the nation endured the Blitz, another kind of war was beginning. A war of shadows. In July 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill approved the formation of a new organization within Whitehall's labyrinth, the Special Operations Executive. Its mission was bluntly put, to set Europe ablaze. It would recruit civilians, linguists, mechanics, and artists, train them in sabotage, disguise and subversion, and send them back into occupied Europe to aid local resistance movements. At Baker Street, London, the SOE's planners began constructing networks across France. Each network, or circuit, was designed to operate in cells of secrecy: a leader, a wireless operator, a courier. Every name, every route, every safe house had to remain compartmentalized. Discovery of one meant the death of many. By 1941, while British forces fought across North Africa and the Atlantic convoys braved the U-boat gauntlet, a quieter army was taking shape. Young men and women, often fluent in French, Belgian, or Dutch, arrived at secret training schools in the Scottish Highlands and the English countryside. They learned how to jump from aircraft at night, how to handle explosives, how to forge documents, and above all, how to blend in. For women, this work was especially perilous. Under German occupation law, female agents had no protection under the Geneva Convention. Capture meant interrogation, torture, and often execution, yet the SOE recruited them in growing numbers. Their inconspicuous appearance, language skills, and capacity for composure made them invaluable couriers and intelligence gatherers. Meanwhile, in occupied France, the Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst (SD) extended their web of control. They tapped telephone lines, infiltrated the resistance, and maintained meticulous card indexes on suspected agents. German control was not absolute, but it was suffocating. Any stranger might be questioned, any forged paper examined under the glare of a lamp. Against this backdrop, Nancy Grace Augusta Wake, a New Zealand-born journalist who had made her home in Marseille, began her quiet rebellion. By the outbreak of war, she had already seen the brutality of the Nazis firsthand. As a correspondent in Vienna, she had witnessed Jews beaten in the streets. When France fell, she chose to stay, not as a reporter, but as a fighter. From 1940 onwards, she began working as a courier for an escape line that ferried Allied airmen and Jewish refugees across the Pyrenees into Spain. Her charm and fluent French allowed her to pass through checkpoints without suspicion. But by 1943, her activities had reached the attention of the Gestapo. They called her the White Mouse. For every time they thought they had caught her, she slipped through another hole. At this stage, Britain's own hopes for victory were uncertain. The United States had not yet entered the war. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival at Stalingrad. In London, Churchill's war cabinet understood that continental Europe could not be liberated by armies alone. It would require networks of resistance, guided, supplied, and inspired by Britain's secret war. The SOE's French section, under Colonel Maurice Buckmaster, began coordinating an intricate system of drops and operations. Parachutes carried weapons, radios, and explosives into the forests and meadows of France. Agents like Wake risked everything to collect them, transport them, and pass them into the hands of local Maquis fighters. In this climate of fear and necessity, the art of disguise became a matter of survival. A false name could buy a day. A well-timed disguise could save a life. For Nancy Wake, it would mean escaping the Gestapo not once, but twice, each time through sheer nerve, improvisation, and courage under fire. By 1942, the occupied territories of France had become a patchwork of control. The northern zone remained under direct German authority, while the south, the so-called Zone Libre, was governed by Vichy France, a regime outwardly independent but bound to Berlin by fear and obligation. Yet beneath the surface, 1,000 small acts of defiance spread like cracks through concrete. The SOE's French section, F section, operating from London, built a network of circuits that threaded through these occupied landscapes. Each circuit bore a code name: Donkeyman, Prosper, Cart, Pat, all linked to London by radio operators who risked detection every time they transmitted. Their orders came through coded BBC broadcasts and microfilms hidden in letters. Agents were trained to live double lives. A forged identity card was memorized as faithfully as a prayer. Each alias required a backstory, a birthplace, a profession, a family history that could withstand interrogation. They learned to recognize German ranks, to spot a tail, to burn papers in seconds. Even a nervous glance could betray a courier's mission. At Wanborough Manor near Guildford and Beaulieu House in Hampshire, training schools turned ordinary civilians into operatives. They were taught lockpicking, silent killing, map reading, Morse, and the fine art of evasion. A single mistake in the field could unravel months of planning. Nancy Wake's arrival into this world of shadow came gradually. Based in Marseille, she and her French husband Henri Fiocca, a wealthy industrialist, opened their home to fugitives and couriers. They distributed food, arranged false papers, and passed messages across the Pyrenees. Her charm and fluency made her invaluable. Few suspected the well-dressed socialite was working for the resistance. But by 1943, the Gestapo had grown suspicious. Interrogations in Marseille and Lyon began to mention a woman courier who matched her description. Her network was penetrated by informers. Friends disappeared overnight. When her husband urged her to flee, she hesitated, until she learned that her name had appeared on a wanted list. The Gestapo's Marseille headquarters circulated her photograph, labeling her Die Weiße Maus, the White Mouse. Escape lines across France were collapsing under pressure. Betrayal, bribes, and exhaustion tore at their seams. Still, Wake's defiance deepened. If they wanted me, she later recalled, they would have to catch me first. Meanwhile, the SOE in London had refined its operations. Agents were exfiltrated by submarine from the Breton coast, or flown out on Lysander aircraft that landed by moonlight on French fields. Supplies were dropped by parachute to remote plateaux, guided by coded torch signals. But every success came at a cost. Each radio transmission could be triangulated by German vans within 20 minutes. Many agents were captured within months of arrival. In the south, the Gestapo and the French milice, a paramilitary police loyal to Vichy, intensified their pursuit of resistance groups. Raids, arrests, and public executions were routine. Entire villages were razed in reprisal. The French countryside, once a refuge, became a hunting ground. By spring 1943, Nancy Wake's position in Marseille was untenable. Friends and couriers had been arrested. Her name was circulating in Gestapo dossiers from Toulouse to Nice. In May, a warning reached her through the underground. The Germans were closing in. With little time to spare, she packed only essentials and began her flight south toward the Pyrenees. Disguised as a housemaid, she joined a group of refugees attempting the perilous crossing into Spain. German patrols swept the valleys. Many who tried were captured. But Wake's endurance and sharp instinct carried her through. Once in Spain, she reached the British consulate, and from there Gibraltar, the great Allied fortress at Europe's southern tip. Within weeks, she was flown to London. There, in a quiet office near Baker Street, she signed the Official Secrets Act and was formally inducted into the SOE. Her code name would be Hélène. Her mission, to return to France by parachute if necessary, and assist in unifying the Maquis ahead of the Allied invasion. What began as a personal act of defiance had now become part of Britain's vast, coordinated underground war. But the Gestapo had not forgotten the White Mouse. Her photograph still hung in their regional offices. They believed she was in London, but they were certain she would return. They were right. Nancy Wake was not a soldier by training, yet few soldiers displayed greater composure under threat. Born in Wellington, New Zealand and raised in Australia, she left home at 16 with a restlessness that would define her life. Paris in the 1930s offered freedom, cafes, conversation, and the confidence of youth. Journalism took her across Europe, where she witnessed fascism tightening its grip. The images she sent home, Jewish men whipped in the streets, shops daubed with swastikas, shaped her conviction that neutrality was impossible. By 1939, she had married Henri Fiocca, a prosperous French businessman, and settled in Marseille. To friends, she appeared every inch the society hostess. Beneath that polish, she was already aiding escape lines. The contrast between silk gloves and smuggled papers became her daily reality. Those who knew her spoke of wit and fearlessness, but also of deep restraint, a private discipline that concealed terror behind humor. The human cost of her work was enormous. Every betrayal, every disappearance was a silent wound. Her husband's eventual capture and execution by the Gestapo, a fact she learned only after the war, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Yet even then she refused sentimentality. Her strength lay not in bravado, but in her capacity to endure without despair, the quiet courage that defined so many of Britain's and France's wartime heroes. The SOE's strategy in France depended on agility and secrecy. Circuits operated like veins beneath the surface, pulsing with intelligence and material. Their aim was to disrupt German control, not through open battle but through sabotage and confusion, cutting telegraph lines, derailing trains, ambushing convoys. Every act forced the occupiers to divert troops away from the front. Nancy Wake's role within this tactical web evolved rapidly. As courier, she linked safe houses, carried instructions, and moved funds to Maquis commanders. The work demanded a cold understanding of risk. She traveled under multiple aliases, sometimes as a journalist, sometimes as a Red Cross nurse. Each identity rehearsed until it became instinct. Her elegance and quick wit disarmed suspicion, a living example of the SOE principle that invisibility was often achieved through confidence rather than concealment. Tactically, women couriers were indispensable. They could cross checkpoints with fewer questions and blend into crowds more easily than armed partisans. Yet their missions were no less lethal. A single lapse in protocol, a repeated route, a misplaced code word, could bring the Gestapo crashing down upon an entire network. The SOE relied on initiative. London could guide, but once in the field, agents like Wake acted alone. When a drop went wrong or a radio failed, improvisation became survival. This autonomy, rare in conventional armies, was the essence of irregular warfare. It demanded intelligence, intuition, and a willingness to decide life or death matters without orders, qualities Wake embodied completely. Behind the romance of resistance lay a precise, almost industrial system of logistics. Each operation depended on wireless transmission, coded messages, and the clandestine movement of men and materials. The SOE's technical officers in Britain produced thousands of forged documents, miniature cameras, and radios disguised as suitcases. Agents in the field carried B2 transmitters, heavy, temperamental sets that could send messages up to 500 miles if weather permitted. Operating them required courage and timing. German detection vans could triangulate a signal within minutes, forcing operators to pack and vanish before patrols arrived. Couriers like Wake often traveled with codes memorized rather than written, each phrase a lifeline to London. Logistically, France was divided by danger. The Pyrenees, the Rhone Valley, the Loire, all barriers threaded with checkpoints and informers. To move between zones, agents relied on railways, bicycles, and sheer luck. Fuel shortages meant vehicles were scarce. Courier work often involved pedaling for days through back roads and forests. Disguise was its own technology. Hair dye, spectacles, provincial accents, all became tools as vital as any pistol. Tailors sympathetic to the resistance adjusted uniforms and civilian clothing to order. For Wake, a nurse's uniform or a domestic servant's apron could be as effective as a firearm. Each disguise represented a calculation. What would seem ordinary here at this hour to this patrol? In such arithmetic lay the difference between capture and survival. Each of these angles reveals a different truth about Wake's story. Courage expressed through intellect, independence and adaptability, the hallmarks of Britain's clandestine war. The SOE's strength rested not merely on courage, but on the invisible chain of leadership stretching from London to the remote farms of occupied France. At the top stood Colonel Maurice Buckmaster, a man of courtesy and iron nerve who directed F Section from a quiet office on Baker Street. His staff worked through the night, decoding transmissions, dispatching aircraft, and monitoring the survival of dozens of agents at once. Their challenge was to maintain coherence in chaos. France was vast, communication unreliable, and betrayal constant. Orders often traveled by bicycle, or in the pockets of couriers who might never return. In such a system, leadership demanded trust. Buckmaster delegated heavily, empowering local circuit leaders like Hubert Faure, Jean Moulin, and others to command Maquis groups with near autonomy. For agents like Nancy Wake, this decentralized command structure was both lifeline and burden. After parachuting into central France in 1944, she operated under the Freddy Jockey network, coordinating with Major John Farmer and Henri Tardivat. With thousands of partisans under nominal control, Wake became not only a courier but a de facto field commander, organizing supply drops, rationing ammunition, and ensuring discipline among often untrained fighters. The relationship between London and the field was built on mutual respect. While Buckmaster provided guidance and resources, it was the agents who interpreted conditions on the ground. Their leadership was improvisational, intuitive, and personal. Authority in these networks did not come from rank or insignia but from competence. Wake earned hers through calm under pressure, quick decision-making, and the ability to command men who, in peacetime, might never have taken orders from a woman. This quiet revolution in gender and authority reflected a wider shift in wartime. Britain, necessity dissolving convention. Life as an SOE agent was an unending psychological trial. Each day began with the knowledge that a mistake could mean not only death, but the capture and torture of others. For Nancy Wake, the burden of secrecy was constant. She could never speak freely, never relax in public. Trust was rationed as carefully as ammunition. The discipline demanded by such work reshaped the mind. Agents were trained to withstand interrogation, to lie without hesitation, and to destroy all sentiment that might compromise them. Yet beneath this armor, the moral strain was immense. To survive, they had to deceive, sometimes even those they sought to protect. For couriers, friendship itself became a risk. The moral boundaries blurred. Resistance fighters executed collaborators. Sabotage killed railway workers as well as soldiers. Each success carried an unseen cost. Wake later reflected on this with characteristic candor. You can't think about it, or you'd go mad. It was not indifference, but compartmentalization, the mental technique that allowed survival amid atrocity. In London, psychiatrists quietly noted the toll among returning agents. Nightmares, guilt, and dislocation were common, though rarely discussed. In the field, such weakness could not be acknowledged. The illusion of composure was as necessary as the disguise itself. For women like Wake, there was an added layer of isolation. Post-war society offered few spaces to reconcile courage with trauma or command with femininity. The war had elevated them to extraordinary responsibility, only to return them to silence when peace came. Yet her defiance, brisk, humorous, unsentimental, was her own form of healing. She would later remark that laughter was the only weapon left when everything else had been taken. From the moment the first SOE agents were dropped into France, their exploits were recorded, quietly during the war, triumphantly afterwards. The British government understood the symbolic value of such stories. In 1942, as the Blitz continued and rationing deepened, tales of resistance offered reassurance that Europe had not surrendered entirely. The figure of the female spy, elegant, cunning, fearless, and it became both a morale tool and a reflection of changing wartime ideals. The BBC's European service, broadcasting nightly from London, carried coded messages to the resistance but also a subtler message to Britain itself, that courage could be ordinary and defiance communal. After the war, the Ministry of Information and the Imperial War Museum curated these accounts carefully, balancing secrecy with inspiration. Nancy Wake's story became one of the most celebrated. Newspapers called her the Gestapo's most wanted woman, and her code name, the White Mouse, took on a mythic quality. Yet beneath the headlines lay a more complex reality. The SOE's operations had succeeded not through individual heroics alone, but through coordination, discipline, and the resilience of countless anonymous helpers. Propaganda simplified what history later restored to nuance. The post-war honors, the George Medal, the Croix de Guerre, the Médaille de la Résistance, recognized not glamour, but service. Her tale embodied the dual narrative of Britain's wartime identity, pragmatic courage, and the quiet triumph of endurance over despair. In the collective memory, these stories bridged the gap between battlefield and home front. They reminded Britain that victory had not been won solely by armies or politicians, but by the invisible network of ordinary people who chose to resist tyranny in silence. From London's radio studios to the forests of central France, Nancy Wake's story reveals the full spectrum of courage, human, tactical, psychological, and cultural. It is within this convergence that her most perilous moments unfolded. The 2 times she defied capture and slipped beyond the Gestapo's grasp, the city that once bustled with traders and artists now breathed in whispers. German patrols prowled the Vieux-Port, and every railway station bristled with suspicion. Posters lined the walls, avis de recherche, wanted. Among the faces, one stood out to those who knew her. Dark eyes, steady gaze, the caption beneath reading Nancy Wake, British agent. Extreme danger. France was free again, but at a staggering cost. That morning, word reached her through a sympathetic clerk at the prefecture. Her name had appeared on the Gestapo's arrest list. Dozens within her escape network had already been taken. A courier brought the warning at dawn. They're coming for you tonight. Within an hour, she burned her remaining papers, destroyed her radio codes, and packed a single satchel. Dressed as a maid, she slipped from her apartment through a side street leading towards the station. Each corner felt alive with watching eyes. She kept her pace even, her face neutral. At a checkpoint near the tram terminus, a German corporal glanced briefly at her papers, stamped them without comment, and waved her through. It was the first of many small mercies. Her route took her north through Nimes and on to Toulouse, guided by fragments of an escape line still functioning under constant pressure. These lines, remnants of the Pat O'Leary network, ferried downed airmen and agents toward the Pyrenees, where guides known as passeurs would lead them across into neutral Spain. But by 1943, the line was collapsing under betrayal and German infiltration. At each safe house, she encountered the same atmosphere: exhaustion, fear, yet an unbroken will to continue. Families risked everything to shelter her. At one farmhouse outside Foix, she was warned that the Gestapo had established new patrols along the mountain passes. The old routes were deadly. Capture meant torture at Frasnes or deportation to Ravensbrück. Even so, the crossing had to be made. On a moonless night, she joined 6 others, airmen, couriers, and a young priest, guided by 2 passers armed only with walking sticks. Snow lay thick in the gullies. The wind came down from Andorra like a blade. They moved silently, each footstep measured. At dawn, a German patrol appeared on the ridge above. The group scattered into the rocks. Wake stumbled, her hands bleeding from the frost, yet refused to rest. She later recalled with characteristic dryness, "I didn't stop because if you did, you froze or you were shot. Both were inconvenient." After 2 days, starving and numb, they crossed into Spain near Port Bru. Arrested by the Spanish Civil Guard, as many refugees were, Wake spent several nights in a local prison before the British consulate in Madrid secured her release. From there, she was sent to Gibraltar, the British stronghold at the edge of the Mediterranean. When she stepped off the transport plane that carried her to England, the contrast was stark. London in mid-1943 bore its own scars: blackout curtains, ration queues, and the weary rhythm of air raid sirens. Yet for Wake, the city represented something profound, not safety but purpose. She had survived. Now she could fight back. Within weeks, she was debriefed at the SOE's Baker Street headquarters. Her testimony about the destruction of escape lines in southern France proved vital to London's understanding of Gestapo tactics. But she refused to remain behind a desk. Her fluency, courage, and experience in the field made her ideal for redeployment. She pressed her case with typical resolve. I didn't come here to drink tea. I came here to go back. By August, she had begun advanced training in parachuting, explosives, and hand-to-hand combat at Ringway and Beaulieu. Instructors noted her precision and stamina. Few could match her marksmanship. Colleagues described her as both charming and formidable, capable of laughter one moment, deadly focus the next. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Gestapo continued its search. They raided Marseille repeatedly, seizing anyone suspected of contact with the White Mouse. In their files, she was listed as missing, presumed in England. Her husband Henri remained behind, refusing to abandon their network. Months later, he would be captured and executed, a fact she would not learn until after the war. Her first escape had come at enormous cost, yet it hardened her resolve. From that moment, she was determined to return to occupied France not as a fugitive, but as a combatant. As 1944 dawned, the Allies prepared for invasion. The resistance in France needed arms, coordination, and leadership. And Nancy Wake, the Gestapo's most wanted woman, volunteered to parachute back into the very territory that had hunted her. Night. A slow, steady drone above the clouds. From the blackness, a parachute blossom opened against the moonlight. Beneath it, Nancy Wake descended towards the forests of the Auvergne, landing hard among damp grass and scattered equipment containers. Within minutes, she had buried her parachute and assembled her radio codes. Now a veteran operative returned to the land that had once nearly claimed her life. She joined the Freddy Circuit, under Major John Farmer, part of the SOE's effort to unite the local Maquisards in preparation for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France. The region around Montluçon, dense with forests and small villages, offered ideal cover. Yet it was a tinderbox. Thousands of young Frenchmen, many barely trained, armed with parachuted Sten guns and grenades, now stood ready to strike against the occupier. Wake's task was formidable: to manage communications, distribute supplies, and ensure that the Maquis obeyed orders rather than impulse. Discipline was her hallmark. When ammunition was wasted on celebration, she ordered it stopped. When morale faltered, she found humor or resolve. She later recalled, "They'd call me Madame André and say I was bossy, but at least they obeyed." German forces, aware of rising resistance activity, launched brutal reprisals. Columns of SS Polizei units combed the countryside, burning farms and executing villagers suspected of aiding partisans. The Gestapo intensified its hunt for the mysterious woman reported to be organizing the rebels. Wake's description was circulated once more: tall, dark-haired, with a clipped accent that could not quite be placed. Her most perilous moment came in June 1944, after D-Day, when the Maquis launched open attacks on German supply lines. A vital radio set, their only link to London, had broken during an airdrop. Without it, no ammunition or rations could be requested. The spare set was held more than 200 kilometers away. With the roads crawling with German patrols, no one dared to make the journey. Wake volunteered. Dressed in a simple black dress, cycling shoes, and carrying a small revolver, she set out alone on a bicycle. The route would take her across enemy territory, through towns swarming with checkpoints. She pedaled for 3 days and nights, sleeping in barns, bribing her way past patrols, and bluffing through inspections with fluent French and unshakable composure. By the time she reached the drop site near Châteauroux, her legs were raw and bleeding. She secured the radio parts, concealed them in her bag, and began the return journey, 500 kilometers in total. When she finally arrived back at camp, exhausted but triumphant, the operators rebuilt the set and made contact with London within hours. The next night, an RAF Halifax dropped supplies to the Maquis, just in time to repel a German assault. It was during these same weeks that the Gestapo came closest to capturing her again. Acting on informants' reports, they raided several villages across the Haute-Loire region. At one, only minutes after Wake had left, German troops stormed the safe house, shooting 2 resistance men and taking the others away in trucks. She learned later that the Gestapo believed her to be operating under a new alias, Madame André. Her reputation, already legendary, became mythic among both friend and foe. To the Germans, she was a phantom. To her comrades, an unyielding leader. As the Allied front advanced northward after D-Day, the Maquis stepped out of the shadows. Under Wake's coordination, they ambushed German convoys, sabotaged railway bridges, and seized ammunition depots. British supply aircraft, guided by her coded signals, delivered thousands of weapons to the resistance fighters. But the cost was appalling. The German reprisal at Montmouchet killed hundreds of partisans and civilians. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane, razed in June 1944, stood as a warning to all. Still, Wake pressed on. The only way to deal with them, she said later, was to hit harder. Her second escape came not by sea or mountain, but through chaos itself. In late August 1944, German units retreated in disarray through central France. Wake's group ambushed a convoy near Montluçon, capturing documents revealing that Gestapo teams had orders to find and execute the Englishwoman André. The search was only hours behind them. She changed clothes once more, adopting the identity of a provincial widow, and disappeared among refugees flooding the roads toward Limoges. By the time the Gestapo arrived, she was gone. Again. Within weeks, Allied forces liberated Paris. Wake remained in the field until the ceasefire, ensuring her men received proper recognition and supplies. When she finally returned to London that autumn, she was no longer the hunted courier of 1943, but a decorated operative whose endurance had altered the course of the resistance war in her region. 2 escapes, 2 lifetimes apart, one by mountains and darkness, the other by disguise and daring. Both define the legacy of a woman who refused the forests of the Auvergne, once alive with the crack of gunfire and coded signals, now stood silent. Burned villages still smoldered. Twisted railway lines scarred the landscape. Liberation had come, but the scars of occupation and reprisal would endure for generations. Nancy Wake's Maquisards emerged from the hills as the Allied columns rolled through Montluçon. Some carried their weapons slung over their shoulders, others walked barefoot, their uniforms little more than rags. Among them she stood quietly, unassuming, composed, her face marked by fatigue and loss. The men called her La Patronne, the boss. Few outside those forests knew how crucial she had been to their survival. In the days following liberation, British liaison officers documented the actions of Wake's resistance groups. Their reports, later archived at the National Archives in Kew, confirmed that her network had destroyed railway lines vital to German logistics, intercepted convoys bound for the Normandy front, and eliminated enemy garrisons across 3 departments. It was among the most effective SOE-supported operations in occupied France, yet the price was unbearable. Hundreds of French civilians had been executed by German forces in reprisal. Dozens of her closest comrades were missing or dead. Wake herself traveled to identify mass graves near Clermont-Ferrand, a duty she performed with the same stoic resolve that had carried her through combat. Only when the guns fell silent did the personal cost become clear. Weeks after Paris was liberated, news reached her from the French authorities. Her husband, Henri Fiocca, had been captured by the Gestapo in Marseille in 1943, tortured and executed for refusing to betray her whereabouts. She had suspected as much but refused to believe it until the report arrived. Witnesses said he never spoke a word of her name. For days, she spoke little. Those around her recalled that she carried on working, filing reports, debriefing agents, settling the affairs of her unit. In one of her rare comments on that loss, she said simply, "He was the bravest of us all." Her return to Britain that winter was subdued. The war in Europe was still unfinished. Operations continued in Norway and the Low Countries. Wake underwent final debriefings at Baker Street, where her commanding officers compiled her official record. It described her as a woman of exceptional courage, resource, and leadership. Another noted, "She shows a complete disregard for danger and an outstanding devotion to duty." She was recommended for multiple decorations. In the months that followed, Britain awarded her the George Medal, one of the highest civilian honors for gallantry. France bestowed upon her the Croix de Guerre with 3 palms and the Médaille de la Résistance. The United States granted her the Medal of Freedom, and Australia, her birthplace, later recognized her with the Companion of the Order of Australia. Yet, despite the medals and the ceremonies, Nancy Wake remained uneasy with the idea of heroism. To her, the war had been about survival, not glory. She often dismissed journalists' attempts to romanticize her exploits. "I hate war," she told one interviewer years later. "But if ever the bastards do it again, I'd be back in the thick of it." By 1945, Europe was exhausted. Wake, only 33, had lived through enough danger for a lifetime. She considered remaining in intelligence work, but the bureaucratic calm of peacetime London felt alien. She was a woman forged by resistance, restless in silence, at ease only in motion. Still, in those final months of 1944, before she left France for the last time, she visited the graves of her comrades, the young men who had followed her into battle. The air was quiet, the leaves turning. In her field diary, she wrote a single line that historians would later find poignant in its simplicity. "We did what we had to do." The war was ending, but for those who had lived it in the shadows, peace brought its own kind of unease. The corridors of the Special Operations Executive emptied. Agents were reassigned, files sealed, and identities quietly erased. For Nancy Wake, whose life had depended on constant movement, the stillness was deafening. She accepted a brief posting with the newly formed Air Ministry Intelligence Department, assisting with interrogation reports on enemy collaborators. Yet the rigid formality of post-war bureaucracy grated against her nature. She had operated on instinct, defiance, and courage, and not paperwork. Within months, she resigned, stating that she preferred action to administration. Her post-war years traced a restless arc across continents. Returning to Australia in 1949, she found her homeland indifferent to the covert war she had fought. Few understood what the SOE had been. Fewer still believed a woman could have commanded hundreds of resistance fighters. In Sydney, she stood for Parliament as a Liberal candidate, campaigning on defence and veterans' welfare. Though she lost narrowly, she continued to speak out for the recognition of resistance veterans and the role of women in wartime service. In 1957, seeking new purpose, she moved to London once more. For a time, she worked at the British Air Ministry, later joining the Royal Air Force's intelligence branch. Those who met her in those years described her as brisk, witty, and unflinching, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and refused to let it diminish her humor. Colleagues recalled her fondness for gin, fast conversation, and an irreverent disregard for authority. She never suffered fools, one remembered, and she never apologized for it. Despite her decorations, Nancy Wake received little financial support from the nations she had served. The George Medal carried no pension, and her wartime pay had been modest. Yet she rarely complained. When asked in later years if she felt overlooked, she replied with characteristic sharpness, "I didn't do it for medals. I did it because I hate bullies." In the decades that followed, as the archives of the Second World War slowly opened, historians began to uncover the full extent of her contribution. Declassified SOE files confirmed the scale of her operations, while French veterans' associations named her among the most effective Allied agents in central France. The BBC's war reports later described her as the most decorated woman of the Allied campaign. In 1985, she published her autobiography, The White Mouse, the nickname given to her by the Gestapo for her ability to elude capture. The book was both candid and unsentimental. She wrote plainly of her husband's death, of the executions she had witnessed, and of the moral ambiguity of resistance warfare. "It was ugly," she wrote, "but the alternative was slavery." Recognition came gradually. The French government invited her to commemorations at Montluçon and Clermont-Ferrand. British veterans groups honored her at Westminster. In Australia, schools and public buildings began to bear her name. Yet she remained at heart a private woman. She lived in a small flat in London's Chelsea, close to the river, where she entertained old comrades and journalists alike, her conversation laced with wit and memory. In her final years, she returned once more to France, visiting the forests where she had fought. Villagers who had known her as Madame André greeted her with quiet reverence. Many had never realized that the woman who led their fathers in battle had been born in New Zealand and raised in Australia. For them, she had always been simply one of their own, a friend who had risked her life for their freedom. Nancy Wake died in 2011, aged 98, at the Royal Star and Garter Home for Veterans in London. Her ashes were scattered in France at Montluçon, the same ground where she had once parachuted into war. At her funeral, the Union flag and the tricolour lay side by side. symbols of the two nations she had served with unwavering loyalty. In the quiet that followed, a line from her wartime file was read aloud, the words of her commanding officer written in 1944. History often remembers its heroes in medals and headlines. But Nancy Wake's story resists that simplicity. Hers was not the loud courage of the parade ground, nor the triumphal kind found in war memorials. It was quiet, deliberate, and born of conviction. When she first entered the war, she was not a soldier. She was a journalist. What turned her into one of Britain's most effective operatives was not ambition, but a refusal to accept tyranny. In that sense, her courage reflected something deeply British, the belief that ordinary individuals, when confronted with evil, must stand firm whatever the cost. The Special Operations Executive was built upon that same spirit. It drew from the unassuming teachers, shopkeepers, radio engineers, nurses, people whose greatest weapon was resolve. Their mission, as Churchill ordered, was to set Europe ablaze. Yet for many, like Nancy Wake, the blaze burned within long before the order was given. Her story also illuminates the quiet unity that defined the Allied effort. A New Zealander, raised in Australia, serving Britain, fighting for France. It was an alliance not only of nations but of principles, liberty, decency, and courage in the face of despair. She embodied the best of that alliance, practical, unsentimental, and fiercely loyal. When she died in 2011, few of her generation remained. Yet her legacy endures not in monuments but in remembrance, the idea that ordinary citizens can defy the machinery of oppression through intelligence, courage, and persistence. In the archives at Kew, her file remains small, a few pages, a photograph, and the words, "Agent escaped," captured twice. But behind those lines lies an entire world of peril, loss, and extraordinary resolve. As Britain rebuilt itself after the war, stories like hers became quiet beacons, reminders that victory was not only measured in battles won, but in the moral endurance of those who refused to yield. Nancy Wake's war ended long ago. Her defiance did not.